Headlines are constantly screaming for our attention, and honestly, it's getting harder and harder to sort through it all. Our whole mission here on the deep dive is really to cut through that noise. We want to give you that clear path, that understanding of the most crucial insights on these global flashpoints, the ones that truly matter. And today, well, we're taking a deep dive into one of the most critical and frankly alarming situations on the planet right now, the escalating Israel-Iran conflict. As of today, June 21, 2025, this conflict has tragically entered its 10th day. 10 days of open hostilities. It started with those targeted Israeli airstrikes, hitting Iranian nuclear and military sites, but it's rapidly spiraled into this dangerous, deadly exchange of missile fire. We're seeing civilian casualties mounting on both sides. And the specter of a much broader regional war, it's really looming large over the entire Middle East. Meanwhile, the United States, under President Donald Trump, finds itself at this really significant crossroads. You've got immense pressure from military involvement on one hand versus these frantic diplomatic efforts on the other. It's a real balancing act. And the global anxiety, well, you can imagine, it's palpable. Everyone's watching. So our deep dive today aims to unpack how this incredibly volatile situation even developed. We'll thoroughly examine the critical political responses, and we're going to focus particularly on the U.S. and the intense internal debates happening right now in Washington. And then we'll explore the far-reaching global impact, everything from, the intricate dance of international diplomacy to the jarring realities of global economics, and of course, the heartbreaking humanitarian consequences. We want you to quickly grasp the core dynamics, the sheer urgent significance of what's unfolding right now. So let's pull back the curtain. Let's really explore this. Okay, June 13, 2025, that's the date when these simmering tensions between Israel and Iran just absolutely erupted. Israeli fighter jets launching precision airstrikes deep inside Iran, hitting critical infrastructure. And then, within hours, Iran retaliates. Fiercely, with a barrage of ballistic missiles aimed right at Israeli population centers. Now, 10 days later, the death toll is tragically rising. The world is holding its breath, this decades-long rivalry. It's threatening to spiral into a full-scale regional war. So the central question for this segment is pretty fundamental. How did we get here? What are the underlying forces driving this incredibly rapid, this dangerous escalation?
Yeah, it's crucial to understand, right? While these recent events feel sudden, even catastrophic, this isn't some spontaneous explosion. This conflict in its current, devastating form, it's really the culmination of a decade-long rivalry. Deeply entrenched, it's this complex interplay of ideological clashes, strategic ambitions, and, let's be honest, a very dangerous shadow war that's been brewing for years, decades, really. The foundation here is built on just profound mistrust and a whole series of specific actions, tit-for-tat moves, that have consistently raised the stakes, incrementally pushing both sides closer and closer to this direct confrontation we're seeing now.
Right. So to really get a handle on this moment, we have to rewind the clock a bit. Let's go back to 1979, the Iranian Revolution. This wasn't just, a change in government. It fundamentally transformed Iran from a monarchy to an Islamic republic under Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And almost overnight, Iran's foreign policy just pivoted dramatically. Israel, which had actually been a relatively close ally of the ousted Shah, suddenly became a prime target, a target of this revolutionary hostility. Iran's new leadership, they branded Israel the Little Satan. It was a direct echo of their condemnation of the U.S. as the Great Satan.
Exactly. That framing was immediate and powerful.
And they immediately vowed to support Palestinian liberation, often explicitly calling for Israel's destruction. That rhetoric was there from the start. But the question is, how did this big ideological shift translate into actual strategic power projection? How did words become actions?
Well, that ideological shift, it very quickly translated into concrete action.
Yeah.
And they used a really sophisticated strategy, proxy warfare. It's become a highly effective blueprint for modern asymmetric conflict, really. Iran started funding and arming various proxy groups across the region, empowering them to directly challenge Israel and other regional adversaries, too, like Saudi Arabia. And they did this without committing its own conventional forces, at least not initially.
Which gave them that deniability.
Exactly. Plausible deniability. It allowed Iran to project power, to bleed its adversaries, but maintain a distance. It's quite strategic. Think about Hezbollah, for instance, formed back in the 1980s in Lebanon. This Shia militia rapidly evolved into Iran's most potent, most well-armed surrogate in the region, no question.
Sure.
Their clashes with Israel, they're well documented. Most notably, you remember the 2006 Lebanon war.
Oh, yeah. Very intense.
They proved to be a formidable adversary, much more than many expected from, a non-state actor. And similarly, Hamas, operating out of Gaza. They've consistently received Iranian weapons, training, financial support. That support directly fueled conflicts like the Gaza wars in 2014 and again in 2021. So this network, this axis of resistance, as Iran calls it, allowed them to exert significant influence, project power, all without direct, overt military confrontation for many, many years. It strategically surrounded Israel with these hostile, non-state actors.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how they developed such a potent strategy without direct engagement for so long anyway. But even as those proxy wars were simmering, heating up, another element emerged. And this one was, well, even more critical, Iran's nuclear program. This became an absolute game changer. It fundamentally altered Israel's strategic calculus. Israel, small nation, constantly feeling surrounded by adversaries, began to see Iran's nuclear ambitions as nothing short of an existential threat, a direct danger to its very survival.
Absolutely existential. That's the key phrase in Tel Aviv.
And by the early 2000s, Iran was actively enriching uranium. Their public line was always, it's purely for civilian energy purposes. But Israel, and let's be fair, a significant portion of the West harbored these deep fears that this was just a cover, a facade for developing actual nuclear weapons. So how did this tension escalate into that covert conflict you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, those fears, they absolutely ignited what we now commonly call the shadow war.
Yeah.
This was a period of intense covert conflict. It largely took place out of public view, but it had very real, very tangible impacts. And what's critical to understand is that these weren't just, isolated incidents. They represented a fundamental strategic choice by both sides, a choice to wage a war without conventional armies. It really signaled a new, volatile form of interstate conflict in the 21st century, cyber warfare, assassination.
Right, like Stuxnet.
Exactly. We saw this vividly in 2010 with the Stuxnet cyber attack, a highly sophisticated digital weapon widely attributed to both Israel and the U.S. This was really an unprecedented act of digital warfare at the time. It effectively crippled Iran's Natanz nuclear facility by sabotaging its centrifuges. It set back their program significantly, no doubt about it.
And then the assassinations.
Yes. Then between roughly 2010 and 2020, there was that chilling series of targeted assassinations. Several Iranian nuclear scientists were killed, often in broad daylight. Iran predictably blamed Israel's Mossad for these precise high-stakes operations. Now, in response, or perhaps just as a parallel progression of its own strategic goals, Iran significantly accelerated its nuclear efforts. They started increasing enrichment levels, moving closer to weapons-grade material, and concurrently, they began testing long-range missiles, explicitly demonstrating capabilities that could reach Israel. So the stakes in this shadow war became incredibly clear, incredibly stark. Israel was determined, absolutely determined, to do whatever it took to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran, while Iran, from its perspective, viewed its nuclear program as an essential deterrent, a deterrent against potential Israeli and Western aggression.
And that intense back and forth, that shadow war, brings us directly to the road to escalation. The breaking point in 2025. After years of these tit-for-tat skirmishes, this deep-seated rivalry, the conflict reached its absolute tipping point this year. And the immediate trigger, the spark for the direct military confrontation we're seeing now, seems to be that critical breakdown in nuclear negotiations. Back in April 2025, the U.S., under President Donald Trump, had restarted talks with Iran. Remember, these were mediated by Oman. Quiet diplomacy. The stated goal was clear: secure a new deal. Iran scales back its nuclear program. The U.S. offers much-needed sanctions relief. Seems straightforward, but what went wrong?
Well, by June, those talks were undeniably faltering. They hit a wall, and it was primarily due to this crucial intelligence disagreement. That proved to be a major, major stumbling block. You see, U.S. intelligence agencies, their assessment was that Iran was still years away from developing a nuclear bomb. And significantly, they believed Iran hadn't restarted its actual weaponization program since halting it way back in 2003.
But Israel saw it differently.
Vastly differently. Israel vehemently disagreed with that assessment. They claimed Iran was far closer than anyone thought, perhaps even on the verge of developing multiple warheads. 9 bombs was the number Netanyahu used later. This divergence in intelligence assessments became this critical point of contention. It just completely undermined the trust needed for any kind of breakthrough. And then the final nail in the coffin, perhaps, June 12th. A U.S.-imposed 60-day deadline for securing a deal with Iran expired. No agreement. That effectively removed the last diplomatic off-ramp.
And the very next day, June 13th, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion. And this wasn't some small symbolic strike, was it? This was a comprehensive operation. We're talking over a dozen targets across Iran, including the Natanz nuclear facility again, key military bases near Tehran, critical missile production sites.
It was extensive.
The strikes were devastating, significant casualties reported, including, crucially, the killing of key figures like Ali Shamkhani. He was Iran's top nuclear negotiator.
A huge blow to diplomacy.
Taking him out really hampered any immediate diplomatic efforts, didn't it? Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu quickly justified these strikes. He stated that Iran was, quote, marching very quickly toward developing 9 nuclear bombs. And it's important, as you said, to explicitly note that claim was directly at odds with the assessments coming from U.S. intelligence at the time.
And Iran's response, well, it was exactly as they promised.
Yep.
Swift and fierce. It demonstrated a clear intent to retaliate decisively, not just absorb the blow. On June 14th, just one day after Operation Rising Lion, Iran fired that barrage of ballistic missiles, aimed directly at Tel Aviv and Haifa, 2 of Israel's largest cities. The impact was horrific. 24 Israeli civilians were killed, over 800 injured in those attacks. It was a stark, terrible reminder of the human cost when this goes from shadow war to direct confrontation. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei immediately vowed, quote, a crushing response, making it absolutely clear this wasn't just a one-off retaliation. This was a signal of a prolonged, escalating conflict. It effectively opened a new, terrifying chapter in this long rivalry.
So if we look at the current state, how this conflict has actually unfolded day by day since those initial strikes, it's just been this brutal cycle of retaliation. June 15th through the 18th, Israel conducted follow-up strikes, hitting Iranian Revolutionary Guard bases, trying to degrade their military capabilities. Iran countered. Launched drones at Israeli military outposts, trying to maybe stretch Israel's defenses thin. Then, June 19th, a deeply concerning escalation. An Iranian missile scored a direct hit on a hospital in southern Israel, 17 people killed. Extensive damage to critical civilian infrastructure.
Targeting a hospital, that's a serious line crossed.
Absolutely. And the very next day, June 20th, Israel retaliated again, bombing missile sites in Qumam, killing a senior Iranian commander, signaling perhaps an intent to target high-value assets. And then today, June 21st, Iran fired yet another barrage of missiles. Thankfully, no immediate casualties reported from this latest attack, but
the cycle continues.
The cycle continues unabated, deepening the humanitarian crisis and raising that specter of an even wider war.
And the human cost. It's already devastating. It's critical we remember that civilians are bearing the brunt of this on both sides. In Iran, local reports, and these are sometimes hard to verify precisely, but they indicate over 224 deaths so far, the vast majority being civilians. Thousands more injured. Hospitals are swamped. There's also been significant damage to their air defenses, to crucial nuclear infrastructure. That has long-term implications. On the Israeli side, as we mentioned, 24 civilian deaths from those missile attacks. Military losses, as usual, remain classified, but the human toll is undeniable there too.
And what about the defenses? Iron Dome, Iran systems?
Well, Israel's Iron Dome system.
Yeah.
It's a highly effective, short-range air defense system designed for rockets, artillery shells. It has successfully intercepted many incoming missiles. It's saved countless lives, no question. However, some have inevitably broken through. It just demonstrates the limits of even the most advanced defense technology against ballistic missiles, especially in large barrages. Iran's defenses, on the other hand, appear to be struggling. They're having a hard time repelling these consistent, sophisticated Israeli airstrikes. It suggests a significant depletion of their capabilities. But, and this is a big but, their vast stockpile of ballistic missiles still represents a very clear and present threat. It makes every single day unpredictable.
And this is definitely not just a regional fight anymore, is it? The U.S. is now deeply involved navigating this incredibly precarious situation. President Trump, we hear, has been holding intense situation room meetings, debating that delicate balance, providing unwavering military support for Israel, its closest ally, versus applying diplomatic pressure on Iran to de-escalate.
A classic dilemma for U.S. presidents in the Middle East.
Absolutely. And there's been a clear signal of heightened risk. Some U.S. embassy staff in the region already evacuated. Allies like Australia, India, they're following suit, pulling their citizens out of the conflict zone. It really underscores the growing international concern. What's perhaps most striking, though, is that intelligence debate swirling around President Trump himself. He's reportedly dismissed the U.S. intelligence assessments that downplay Iran's immediate nuclear threat, choosing instead to align more closely with Israel's more urgent, perhaps more alarmist view.
Indeed. And Dr. Sarah Cohen, a prominent Middle East historian, she put it very insightfully, I thought. She commented, the June 13th strikes fundamentally shifted this from a Cold War to a hot one. Israel's preemptive move, she said, clearly reflects a belief that diplomacy alone can't stop Iran, and Iran's subsequent retaliation shows unequivocally that it won't back down either. Her conclusion: we are truly in uncharted territory now, facing an escalation trap that could pull in far more actors. That highlights a critical insight, doesn't it? Both sides likely believe they acted defensively or preemptively defensively, but their actions have locked them into this dangerous cycle. Retreat is seen as weakness. Continued escalation feels almost inevitable without some major external intervention or sudden shift.
So as you can clearly see, this deep dive into the historical roots, the current flashpoint, it reveals how this decades-long rivalry, fueled by mistrust, proxy battles, deep-seated nuclear fears, it's now exploded. Full-scale open warfare. The June 13 strikes were the spark, absolutely. But the kindling, well, that had been piling up for years and years, creating this incredibly combustible environment. With casualties mounting daily, no clear off-ramp in sight, the huge question now is, how far will this go? And what are the significant implications for global stability? Implications that will ultimately affect every one of us, you included, regardless of where we live. Welcome back to the deep dive. In our first segment, we really trace the history, the rapid escalation of the Israel-Iran conflict, a rivalry that has now tragically erupted into open warfare. But as we start to touch on, this isn't just some distant crisis unfolding halfway across the world. No, it's rapidly become a major political lightning rod right here in the United States. Leaders are grappling with how to respond. The American public is deeply, deeply divided. So today in this segment, we're going to dive into that political fallout. From the White House to the halls of Congress. From rigid party lines to the complex nuances of public opinion, how exactly is Washington reacting to this volatile moment? And crucially, what does it mean for America's pivotal role on the world stage? Let's start right at the top with President Donald Trump. As the world's superpower, as Israel's closest ally, America's response could genuinely shape the entire course of this conflict. No exaggeration. But the path forward for President Trump, well, it's anything but clear, isn't it? He's known for his bold, often unpredictable foreign policy, and he's currently navigating this minefield of competing pressures. There's the pressure to support Israel unequivocally, there's the desperate need to try and avoid a wider war, and he's managing a deeply divided electorate just months before critical midterm elections. That political context is huge.
Absolutely crucial.
His initial reaction to those June 13th strikes, it was a fascinating mix, wasn't it? Reported restraint initially, and then ultimately that characteristic bravado. Tell me more about that initial reaction.
It's true. It was quite revealing. When Israel launched those surprise strikes on June 13th, President Trump was, according to multiple sources, caught quite off guard. Really didn't see it coming that way. His initial reaction reportedly was actually one of opposition to the move. Remember, he had been actively hoping to secure that nuclear deal with Iran. Those talks in Oman were his initiative, really. He viewed a diplomatic solution as preferable.
A deal maker wanting a deal.
Exactly. But then came the urgent briefings from his national security team. And these briefings apparently highlighted Israel's claims very forcefully. Claims that Iran was on the verge of building multiple nuclear bombs, a much, much more dire assessment than his own intelligence agencies were providing. And that seemed to shift his thinking rapidly. He quickly authorized limited U.S. support, specifically assistance in intercepting those Iranian missiles that were subsequently aimed at Israel. It signaled a clear shift towards backing Israel's immediate defense needs.
Yet his public messaging, as you'd almost expect, has been an absolute roller coaster since then. Just days ago, he posted on X, formerly Twitter, that direct, unequivocal demand. Iran must unconditionally surrender now. We know exactly where the so-called supreme leader is hiding. Very aggressive language.
Very.
But then, in almost the same breath, he's telling reporters publicly, I don't want war. Nobody wants war. This clear contradiction, it really illustrates the tightrope he's walking, doesn't it?
It really does.
He's attempting to project that image of unyielding strength, resolve. That plays incredibly well with his base. But simultaneously, he's trying to avoid a conflict that could easily spiral out of control, a conflict that could define the remainder of his presidency in a very, very negative light. And perhaps the most striking move recently has been President Trump's 2-week deadline for diplomacy. That's a classic negotiating tactic for him, setting these hard deadlines. Speaking from the Oval Office on June 18th, he issued that stark warning. If Iran doesn't come to the negotiation table within 14 days, the U.S. could initiate airstrikes on Iranian targets. Now, this ultimatum naturally has sparked fierce debate within his own administration. It's highlighting these deep divisions on how to best handle the crisis. On one side, you have advisors like National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. He's arguing for restraint. pointing back to those U.S. intelligence assessments. Assessments that indicate Iran is still years away from a bomb, suggesting a military response is premature, unnecessary right now. But on the other side, you have figures like Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. He's warning forcefully that Iran's current missile capabilities pose an immediate grave threat to both Israel and U.S. interests in the region. He's advocating for a more decisive approach.
And Trump himself seems to be siding more with the Austin view, or at least the Israeli intelligence.
Well, what's particularly telling is Trump's personal dismissal of those U.S. intelligence reports. He explicitly stated they got it wrong before and they're wrong now. Iran is closer than anyone thinks. He's explicitly echoing Israel's more urgent stance there. That puts him directly at odds with his own spy agencies, and that could have huge policy implications. As political analyst James Lee observed, Trump's approach is classic bold statements, mixed signals, and a deadline to force action. But it's risky.
Very risky.
If diplomacy fails, Lee says, he's boxed himself into a corner where military action might be the only way to save face. And with midterms looming, he can't afford to look weak. That dynamic creates this incredible pressure cooker right inside the White House.
And while the White House is grappling with these incredibly high-stakes decisions, Congress is anything but quiet. You can hear the noise from Capitol Hill. The Israel-Iran conflict has truly exposed that stark partisan divide, hasn't it? Reflecting these long-standing ideological differences in American foreign policy, Republicans, by and large, are rallying behind Israel, and by extension, behind President Trump's tougher stance, mostly. House Speaker Mike Johnson, for example, he called the Israeli strikes a necessary defense against an existential threat. He urged the U.S. to provide Israel with, quote, whatever it needs to finish the job. Senator Lindsey Graham went even further. He suggested Congress should actively authorize military force if Iran doesn't back down. It underscores that hawkish stance that aligns so deeply with the Republican Party's base, where support for Israel is just incredibly strong, a core tenet.
Absolutely. It's foundational for many Republicans. But in stark contrast, Democrats are largely pushing for caution, for restraint, emphasizing diplomatic solutions over military escalation. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, along with other key figures like Senator Mark Warner, they issued a joint statement urging President Trump to consult Congress before any significant military escalation. Senator Warner, remember, he chairs the powerful Senate Intelligence Committee. He explicitly emphasized the critical need for diplomacy. He said, "We cannot afford another forever war in the Middle East. The American people deserve a say in this." That reflects a real wariness among many Democrats about foreign entanglements, especially after Iraq and Afghanistan.
And it's not just policy, it's process too, right? The War Powers Act.
Exactly. The divide here isn't just about the policy strike or don't strike. It's fundamentally about the process. Democrats are invoking the War Powers Act. That's the federal law intended to check the president's power to commit the U.S. to armed conflict without explicit consent from Congress. They're arguing any sustained military action requires that explicit congressional approval. Republicans naturally counter that. They argue the president has inherent authority as commander-in-chief to act swiftly, decisively, in defense of an ally, especially in a time of crisis like this. This standoff, it could very well lead to a high-stakes battle right there on Capitol Hill. We could see votes on resolutions designed to either limit or conversely expand Trump's war powers. That could set a precedent for future presidents.
And it's not monolithic within the parties either, is it? There are nuances.
No, absolutely not. It's important to remember, Congress isn't monolithic, even within the parties. You have moderate Democrats, think Senator Joe Manchin, maybe from more conservative states. They've expressed support for Israel's right to self-defense, prioritizing that long-standing alliance. At the same time, you have more progressive voices, like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They've condemned the Israeli strikes as reckless escalation. They're calling for de-escalation, focusing on humanitarian concerns. That reflects a growing segment of the party really skeptical of military intervention anywhere. And on the Republican side, you still have those isolationist figures, like Senator Rand Paul, warning loudly against, quote, dragging America into another Middle East quagmire, emphasizing a non-interventionist stance that definitely clashes with the party's mainstream hawkish views. These internal nuances, they just highlight the deeply complex, often contradictory impulses within both major American political parties when it comes to foreign policy. It's never simple.
Okay, so you have all this debate roaring in Washington. What does the American public actually think about all of this? How are people outside the Beltway processing it? A recent Fox News poll, conducted pretty quickly after the strikes, June 13th to 16th, it reveals a nation largely split right down the middle. 49% of voters approve of Israel's actions, but a very close 46% disapprove, almost perfectly divided.
Strikingly divided.
But when you dig just a little deeper into those numbers, the partisan divide is absolutely glaring. A huge 73% of Republicans support Israel's strikes. Compare that to just 32% of Democrats and independents.
Wow, that's a huge gap.
Huge gap. This polarization, honestly, it just mirrors the broader political landscape we become so accustomed to, doesn't it? Where even complex foreign policy issues become deeply intertwined with domestic tribalism. For many Republicans, Israel's security is that absolute top priority. They view Iran as this implacable foe that must be confronted decisively, full stop. Democrats, meanwhile, they're generally more likely to prioritize diplomatic solutions. They express significant concern over the civilian casualties in Iran, and they're just inherently wary of new military conflicts abroad.
But interestingly, that same poll also highlighted a crucial point of common ground, hidden amidst the division. 73% of voters across party lines, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, see Iran as a real threat to U.S. national security.
So the threat perception is shared, even if the solution isn't.
Exactly. It suggests that while Americans are certainly divided on Israel's specific tactics or the optimal U.S. response, there's actually widespread bipartisan agreement on the underlying danger posed by Iran, particularly its nuclear program and its regional destabilization efforts. And as we mentioned, with midterm elections just months away, these numbers really matter. They're shaping campaign rhetoric. They could impact voter turnout dramatically. President Trump and his allies, you can bet, are highly likely to frame strong support for Israel as a litmus test, for patriotism, for strength. It's a key differentiator to rally his base. Democrats, on the other hand, may very well use the conflict to rally their base. Around calls for restraint, increased congressional oversight, appealing to those voters tired of forever wars. This conflict could easily become a significant wedge issue, influencing everything from local races right up to the national conversation. As political strategist Maria Gomez insightfully put it, public opinion is a double-edged sword here. Trump needs to show he's tough on Iran to keep his base happy, but if the conflict drags on or escalates, swing voters might punish him for getting the U.S. entangled. It's a high-wire act, she says, where missteps could cost him dearly at the ballot box.
So, beyond the immediate political jockeying, beyond the upcoming midterm elections, what does this conflict really mean for America's broader role on the world stage? How does it test its alliances, its place in global leadership?
Yeah, this Israel-Iran conflict, it really poses profound questions for U.S. foreign policy. It's challenging decades of established norms, established alliances. For decades, the U.S. has stood as Israel's staunchest ally, providing billions in military aid, crucial diplomatic cover at the UN and elsewhere. But this current crisis, it's testing the very limits of that long-standing alliance. If President Trump decides to commit U.S. forces directly to the conflict, it risks entangling America in a protracted war with Iran. That's a scenario that would undoubtedly strain already stretched military resources, and it would significantly erode public support, especially given the public's general weariness after years and years of conflict in the Middle East.
And the regional stability aspect.
Huge risk. Moreover, the conflict carries this immense risk of destabilizing the entire Middle East. Iran's network of proxies, groups like Hezbollah and Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, they could potentially open new fronts, launching attacks on Israel or perhaps U.S. interests in the Gulf, neighboring countries like Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states. While they're inherently wary of Iran, they're also deeply anxious about being drawn into a wider, devastating war. A war that could unravel regional stability, tank their economies. The potential for miscalculation in this environment is incredibly high. And the cascading consequences could be truly catastrophic, far beyond the immediate battle lines between Israel and Iran. And then on the global stage, America's response is under intense scrutiny. It's testing its leadership, its credibility. Key allies like the UK, France, Germany, they're already urging restraint. They're wary of a major regional conflagration. Meanwhile, adversaries, like Russia and China, they could strategically exploit the chaos, maybe advance their own interests, strengthen ties with Iran, challenge U.S. influence in other regions while America is distracted. Ultimately, President Trump's decision, whether he doubles down on unwavering support for Israel or pivots towards a more robust diplomatic approach, that decision will reverberate far beyond the immediate region. It will shape the global geopolitical landscape for years to come.
Wow. Okay, so the political response to the Israel-Iran conflict, it really is a microcosm, isn't it, of America's broader foreign policy debates. Intervention versus restraint, unilateral action versus multilateral diplomacy, and of course, that ever-present shadow of partisan politics coloring everything. President Trump's next move in this crisis could very well define his presidency and fundamentally shape the future of the Middle East, which raises an important question for you, our listener. How do you think the U.S. should navigate this incredibly complex landscape, balancing its commitments with that overwhelming desire shared by many to avoid a wider war? Lots to think about there. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've just explored the deep historical roots of the Israel-Iran conflict and its intense political echoes right here in the U.S. But this crisis, truly, it's not just a regional issue, nor is it simply a U.S. story. It is, without a doubt, a global flashpoint. It has the profound power to reshape international relations, to massively disrupt global economies, and, tragically, to unleash a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions. From the diplomatic halls in Europe to Asia's vital oil markets, the entire world is on edge right now.
Absolutely. The world is holding its breath, and for good reason. Because the potential for this conflict to draw in other superpowers, to choke off critical oil supplies through places like the Strait of Hormuz, and to displace millions of people, that potential is very real. It could create a refugee crisis that ripples globally, impacting Europe, neighboring countries, everyone. This is clearly no isolated skirmish. It's a crisis with stakes that span the entire globe. As missiles fly, as tensions continue to rise, leaders worldwide are in this desperate race against time to try and contain the fallout. But with Israel and Iran locked in such a deeply entrenched standoff, the prospect of peace honestly feels incredibly distant right now.
Let's look first at Europe's response. Europe is really trying, aren't they? Trying to lead the charge on diplomacy here. They're leveraging their significant legacy with the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. They invested so much diplomatic capital in that.
They really did. It was a cornerstone of their foreign policy for a while.
The UK, France, Germany, they're all actively pushing for calm amidst this escalating storm. Driven by this deep concern for regional stability, yes, but also the potential for a new migrant crisis hitting their shores. The United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, he's demanded an immediate ceasefire. He's cautioning that the conflict could spiral out of control and engulf the region. He's pressing for talks to resume as fast as possible. France's President Emmanuel Macron, he's even floated a UN-led mediation plan, suggesting maybe neutral parties like Turkey or Qatar could act as go-betweens. He's reportedly told Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu quite directly, military action won't solve this long-term, advocating for a more comprehensive political solution. And Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he's urging both sides to just break the cycle of violence. And he's specifically nudging the U.S., trying to get them to flex their diplomatic muscle for a truce, given America's unique influence with Israel.
But let's be realistic, it's an undeniable uphill fight for them. Given the entrenched positions of both sides right now, Israel's firm position remains. Iran's nuclear ambitions must be crushed. Not just contained, crushed. That's a very hard line. While Iran is equally insistent, Israeli attacks must cease first, before any talks can begin. They view any concessions without that as weakness. EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell, he put it starkly, didn't he? The window for peace is closing. Every day of fighting narrows it further. It underscores the real urgency of the moment. Dr. Hans Mueller, a European affairs expert, commented, "Europe's caught in a bind."
Yeah.
They're desperate to save the nuclear deal, or what's left of it, and avoid a wider war, he says, which would have direct economic and security consequences for the continent. But Israel's moves have effectively boxed them in. His question: can they pull off a ceasefire? Time's running out. Their efforts, while certainly earnest, are up against decades of deep-seated animosity and these immediate acute threats that just overshadow those long-term diplomatic goals right now.
Okay, now let's turn our attention eastward to China. China is not only Iran's top trade partner, a crucial economic lifeline for Tehran, but also a rising global power with significant interest in Middle East stability, more so than ever before. Beijing seems to be playing a remarkably careful, calculated game here, a real balancing act between its economic imperatives and its growing geopolitical ambitions. Officially, China has called Israel's actions reckless, a breach of international law. They're urging restraint from both sides. However, it's notable, isn't it? They're not throwing their full diplomatic or economic weight around in the way that perhaps they could. It demonstrates a very nuanced approach.
That's right. China's strategic balancing act is fascinating to watch because their priorities are complex, very complex. They have significant ties to Iran, primarily through those crucial oil imports. That oil fuels their massive economy, and through the extensive Belt and Road infrastructure projects, which are central to their global connectivity strategy.
So a war is bad for business.
It's exactly. A wider war would undoubtedly tank global trade. That would hit China's export-driven economy incredibly hard. It could affect its internal stability, which is always paramount for Beijing. As Dr. Li Wei, a strategist based in Beijing, notes, stability is Beijing's priority above all else. But, she adds, it'll defend its interests if pushed. The word on the ground, the diplomatic chatter, is that China is quietly pressing Iran behind the scenes to cool off, and simultaneously warning Israel, also quietly, to back down from further escalation. It demonstrates this pragmatic desire for de-escalation, but without taking a strong public stance that might alienate either side or draw them in too deeply. Dr. Wei also suggests this is a chance for Beijing to flex its Middle East clout. A peace deal, she argues, would be a big win for China. It would position them as a major diplomatic player, maybe even a more credible mediator than the U.S. in the eyes of some regional actors. They're meticulously calculating their moves, protecting their economic interests, enhancing their regional and global influence. It's all about calculation.
And then there are the Gulf states, nations like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, others in the region. There's this palpable mix of, well, fear on one hand and calculated self-interest on the other. They undeniably see Iran as a longtime foe, a rival for regional dominance, a destabilizing force through its proxies. No love lost there.
None at all.
But they absolutely do not want a front row seat to a full-blown war, much less be directly drawn into one, given their own economic vulnerabilities and those very raw memories of past conflicts and attacks.
Indeed. And you hear very specific Gulf voices reflecting this complex dynamic. A senior Saudi official speaking off the record, of course, stated, "We back Israel's self-defense, but a regional war is the last thing we need." Clear message there. In that perspective, it's deeply rooted in their own recent history. They vividly recall the painful memories of Iran's 2019 strike on the Saudi Aramco oil facilities that severely disrupted their oil production, sent shockwaves through global markets.
They don't want to repeat.
Absolutely not. The UAE, while also condemning Iran's missile attacks, is pleading for calm. Their highly diversified economy, heavily reliant on trade, finance, tourism, is particularly vulnerable to the chaos of war. Then you have Qatar, actively offering to mediate. They're leveraging their significant ties hosting that major U.S. military base, but also maintaining lines to Iran. They have a track record as a regional go-between. And Oman, playing its traditional neutral card, simply calling for calm and dialogue, maintaining its long-standing policy of non-alignment, trying to be a bridge.
Is there an upside for them in this crisis?
Well, what's interesting is that some in the Gulf are also sniffing out a potential opportunity in this crisis. It sounds cynical, but it's realpolitik. A potentially weaker Iran, maybe severely degraded by conflict, could, in theory, open doors for stronger ties with Israel. Building on the Abraham Accords, those historic normalization agreements from 2020, this could fundamentally reshape regional alliances, create a new geopolitical architecture more favorable to them. However, as analyst Fatima Al-Khalifa offers that sobering warning, one misstep and the region could go up in flames. The tightrope these nations are walking is incredibly thin, very dangerous.
Okay, beyond the political and diplomatic maneuvers, let's talk about the money. The conflict is already rattling global markets, especially in the energy sector. This economic impact is a critical global ripple effect. It affects everyone, right? From consumers like you at the gas pump to international shipping companies to global inflation rates. Brent crude oil prices, for instance, jumped a significant 5% in just the first week of this conflict. And frankly, the fear is the worst might still be ahead.
That's the chilling reality, isn't it? Energy analyst Sarah Thompson, she starkly warns, if the Strait of Hormuz gets hit, prices could double overnight. Double.
Wow. Strait of Hormuz. Explain its significance again.
It's this crucial, narrow bottleneck. 20%, 1/5 of all global oil supplies pass through it every single day, and it lies squarely in Iran's crosshairs. Geographically, they dominate it. It makes it a highly vulnerable point. The threat of mines or missiles or even just heightened tensions disrupting passage through that strait, it could choke off a massive portion of the world's oil, with immediate severe consequences for global energy security. And beyond just oil, higher energy costs would trigger widespread inflation across various sectors, snarl supply chains from Tokyo to New York, affecting virtually every industry reliant on transportation and energy. Economist James Peterson, he predicts, this might be the decade's oil shock, recalling those dramatic price spikes during the oil crises of the 1970s.
We've seen glimpses before, right?
We have. Remember 2019? Iran seized a British tanker in the strait. Prices spiked just on that incident. Today's stakes with open warfare are immeasurably higher. Markets around the world are absolutely jittery, reflecting this profound fear of a sustained disruption.
But the most sobering aspect of all this, and the one that really demands our immediate attention, our compassion,
Mm.
is, of course, the humanitarian toll. It's already grim, and tragically, it's growing daily. Civilians on both sides are bearing the absolute brunt of this escalating conflict, caught in the crossfire of missile barrages, airstrikes. In Iran, those local reports suggest over 200 civilians already dead from the Israeli strikes, thousands more injured, hospitals completely swamped, struggling to cope with the influx of casualties. In Israel, Iran's missiles have killed those 24 civilians, injured dozens more, leaving communities reeling. Leah Cohen, a resident of Tel Aviv, she shared her anguish with reporters, saying, "We're on edge 24/7. That sentiment is echoing in every impacted community right now. The fear is palpable. The psychological impact is profound."
And the United Nations, they're already sounding the alarms, talking about a looming humanitarian catastrophe. They're warning that millions, literally millions, could be forced to flee their homes if this conflict escalates further, creating a massive new wave of internally displaced persons, refugees, burdening neighboring countries, stretching resources thin globally. Aid groups like the Red Cross, Red Crescent, they're already stretched incredibly thin, struggling to provide basic necessities, food, water, shelter, medical care in a rapidly deteriorating environment. Access to affected areas is becoming increasingly difficult. Vital supplies are running short. Maria Santos, a humanitarian advocate, she made a desperate call saying, "It's a multi-front crisis. We need a ceasefire yesterday before this becomes unmanageable." And humanitarian worker Ahmed Farouk, he gave a particularly chilling personal account from the ground. He shared hospitals are out of supplies and the injuries are brutal. Many are complex trauma cases requiring specialized care that just isn't available right now. The world has to act. Lives are on the line, and the fabric of society is tearing apart. The human suffering, it's immense, and it's escalating rapidly. A stark, terrible reminder of the ultimate cost of conflict.
So the global ramifications of this conflict, they extend far, far beyond the immediate conflict zone in the Middle East. They're profoundly affecting economies, trade, energy prices, and most importantly, human lives worldwide, making this a crisis that truly demands immediate international attention and comprehensive understanding from everyone, from you, from me, from our leaders. Okay, as we bring this deep dive to a close, let's try to synthesize the key takeaways from our exploration of this escalating Israel-Iran conflict. What we've really seen is a geopolitical powder keg, one rooted in decades of profound mistrust, ideological opposition. And now it has fully erupted into open confrontation. Israeli strikes targeting Iranian military and nuclear sites, met with immediate fierce missile barrages from Iran, setting this dangerous precedent for direct state-on-state escalation.
And at the very heart of this clash, as we've discussed, is Iran's nuclear ambition, or at least Israel's perception of it, versus Israel's absolute resolve to stop it. It's a fundamental standoff. And there appears to be no easy resolution in sight, given the core security concerns driving both nations. The United States, under President Trump, finds itself at this incredibly critical juncture. His choices could either de-escalate these mounting tensions, maybe through some 11th-hour diplomatic effort, or far more dangerously, they could plunge the entire region into widespread chaos if he opts for more direct military intervention, perhaps after his deadline expires. We've also observed that deeply split public opinion right here in the U.S. It reflects that larger, ongoing national debate about America's proper role in an increasingly volatile Middle East. Interventionism versus restraint. Globally, reactions have been, well, a mixed bag, haven't they? Some nations rushing to evacuate their citizens, signaling immediate danger. Others desperately pushing for calm, for mediation, trying to avert a catastrophe. But the risks, they are undeniably clear. Persistent regional instability, massively disrupted global oil markets, and that growing, horrifying humanitarian toll. As political analyst James Lee summarized it, Trump's navigating a delicate balance backing Israel without sparking a broader conflict. The public split reflects deep debates over U.S. foreign policy, and with midterms looming, this could shape the political landscape in unprecedented ways.
So the big question remains, what's next? The coming days, the coming weeks, they feel absolutely pivotal, truly. The world is watching, holding its breath to see which path unfolds from here, and the potential outcomes couldn't be more starkly different.
Well, there is, of course, always a chance, perhaps a slim chance, for diplomacy. You could imagine maybe talks reconvening somewhere neutral, perhaps Geneva, leading eventually to a ceasefire, maybe renewed nuclear negotiations down the line. Success there, though, would demand huge compromises. Israel halting its strikes, Iran pausing its nuclear program, maybe accepting more intrusive international safeguards, the U.S. easing sanctions to provide some incentive. But we have to acknowledge, realistically, this is at best a long shot right now. Given the deep-seated mistrust, the immediate hostilities, the domestic political pressures on all sides to demonstrate strength, not weakness.
So what's the alternative path?
The alternative, and arguably the more dangerous path, is continued escalation. If President Trump's 2-week deadline passes without any tangible diplomatic progress, well, potential U.S. airstrikes could follow, perhaps targeting Iran's remaining military capabilities or its nuclear infrastructure more directly. That kind of action could swiftly pull in Iran's proxy allies. Hezbollah, the Houthis, potentially opening new fronts against Israel, against U.S. interests in the Gulf, further destabilizing an already incredibly fragile region. And there's still that critical uncertainty, that intelligence gap surrounding Iran's nuclear program. Israel claims the threat is imminent, 9 bombs worth. U.S. estimates still suggest, publicly at least, more time is needed for Iran to build a bomb. That gap itself is dangerous. Either way, the stakes are just sky high. We're talking massive economic fallout from disrupted oil supplies, disrupted trade routes, a rapidly worsening humanitarian crisis, potentially millions displaced, and that terrifying specter of a much wider, much more devastating war. A war that could redraw the map of the Middle East. Dr. Maria Hassan, a Middle East expert, she concluded insightfully, I think. The world's response is a mixed bag. Europe and China want peace, but Gulf states are torn. A misstep could spiral into something much bigger, with oil prices and human lives hanging in the balance, creating a crisis that defines our generation.
Which leaves us and you with a final thought to ponder. Considering the sheer weight of these historical animosities, the intricate web of proxy networks we've discussed, and the immense global economic and humanitarian stakes, what would it truly take, something perhaps beyond traditional military action, beyond conventional diplomacy as we know it, to fundamentally reshape the trajectory of the Israel-Iran rivalry in the long term? And how might that kind of fundamental shift impact the very definition of security, stability, and life itself in the Middle East for generations to come? Something to think about.